Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy, and by Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, our lecturer in theology here at Catholic Studies Academy. And as we get started today, I just want to remind all of our listeners, please help us out, help us to grow our online community, and help us to reach out to more people by sharing our content, smashing the like button, and anything else that you're supposed to do with social media. So we just want to invite you, please just help us out, share our content. And if you're interested in formal classes, go check out all of our content, including classes taught by Dr. Bulzacchelli and Dr. Smith in theology and philosophy over at catholicstudiesacademy.com. All right, so today our topic is going to be crisis, or I don't know, how do you say the plural in crisis? Because we got a crises. Yeah, I don't know. We have a lot going on now. And so today we just want to kind of look at the landscape and kind of just take stock of where we see things, how we see things, what do we see as problematic, and if we can, maybe even provide some wisdom and insight into navigating the strange world that we now live in. You know, I'm always a big fan of those survival shows where they go out into some unknown place that's full of death and despair. I want to be the survivalist that goes out there and knows which plant to eat and which plant not to eat. So
I want to be the guy with the cool bunker.
Yeah. So Dr. Smith, maybe you can point us to some water in the arid landscape of lackluster philosophies that are out there, and Dr. Bulzacchelli, maybe you can point us to some refreshing plant that will provide us sustenance and the theological chaos that we are
life, maybe,
that we're trying to navigate here. So let's get started, and we're just gonna kind of just do a kind of a roundtable kind of a deal here, and so let's begin with Dr. Bulzacchelli. When you look at the world, when you look at just the landscape that we're in, how do you go about diagnosing the problem or problems?
Yeah, the problem that one of the major problems that I find, this sounds like a cop-out, but it's not, is that I don't even know where to begin, because it's there's so much wrong, I think. And all the problems are sort of interrelated, right? They all kind of feed into each other. But I think one of the problems, that I see really at the root of it all, it's less of a symptom and more of a cause, right? Is a lack of an ability to kind of think rationally, right? It's an emotivism or something, a reactivism, right? So we have a society that is highly volatile, and this has become, I think, it's flooded the entire Western world, where you just sort of say the wrong word, right? Or you jump on the wrong side of the line, and everything is electric. Everything is like the third rail, and there's no rational discussion after that. So tribalism has replaced debate, right? There's no actual debate. There's just fighting. That, I think, is one of the really deep causes. Until you solve that problem, you don't solve other problems. But I think at sort of a much larger scale, if I were to look at the metastasization of this, right, I would kind of say that there's a radical realignment happening in the world, and there's a crisis in trust of institutions, right? And at all levels, political, religious, it's massive.
With regards to this, you know, not having the ability to think rationally, what do you
Mhm.
think? What do you think led to? Do you think it was just like laziness or sloth that we just kind of found thinking to be hard, so we stopped? Or what do you think? What do you think actually led to kind of just this decline in rational thinking?
Yeah, well, this is why I say it's hard to know where to begin. Because
Yeah,
on the one hand, I see the lack of ability to think rationally and instead to just sort of react and take sides, right?
yeah,
As a root cause of the problem. On the other hand, one could argue that it's a symptom, right? That it's a symptom of that it's what results, right, from a change in the way we approach education,
mm,
um, which goes back a very long way, right?
yeah,
And and a need to sort of what would I say? There's a tendency to what does cause it? There's a tendency, I think, to want everyone to be, well, to not really have their feelings scarred or something, right? And and so we look at we look at achievement differently,
hmm, yeah,
and maybe that means, you know, that we start saying that all opinions are of equal merit, right? That kind of thing, until finally there's no real basis for discerning one argument from another. And once that happens, there's no argument at
yeah.
all. I'm not really sure. I wonder what, I don't know, maybe Dr. Smith has a better take on how that happens.
I was actually talking about this a little bit this week. We started classes just last week at a local university where I do some teaching. And one of the things I was actually talking about the benefits of philosophy and studying philosophy, which is, kind of a stock thing you talk about at the beginning of introduction to philosophy class, right? And I actually, you might be surprised at this, Rich, but I actually used an idea from Immanuel Kant to talk about this. One of the interesting ideas that he talks about, which I think has some purchase, is the idea that the concept that he coins of public reason,
Mhm.
right? That there is a kind of public discourse that we're all involved in to a greater or lesser degree.
Yeah.
Now, the boundaries and the participants in that public discourse have radically expanded due to technology, right?
Mhm.
Also, you might say the quality of participants has diversified greatly as well, right? In terms of everybody has a voice. In a way, that's cool. I kind of like that, to be perfectly honest. At the same time, there's a lot of people who are out there just
Spouting.
just spouting, throwing things out there without a lot of training, consideration, that sort of thing. And so one of the things I recommended to the students was this idea that we're all contributing to a conversation that helps to mold our society. And that what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're contributing in a way that is responsible, effective, useful, edifying, etc. Right? And
Yeah.
that philosophy is good training to help you do that. So you're not throwing out there completely irrational ideas, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so in a way, I would like to say, what you're pointing to is kind of I call it the decline of public reason, right?
Yeah.
I
Right.
really like this funny. I think Thomas just takes this straight from Aristotle, but there's a point where Thomas, because I'm pretty sure it's in his commentary on the Politics, which is short, but also might be in his commentary on the Ethics. He says that that the words we say about justice makes society. Isn't that interesting? Kind of,
Mhm.
insight. I like that. It's a kind of a, it's a kind of an insight there. But I think it is the case that our public reason has declined. It's become hopelessly kind of confused right? And what you're talking about, the kind of the emotivism of it, the extreme. I mean, you use the metaphor third rail just a minute ago. If you sort of think like, if every rail is a third rail, how can there be a third rail? Like
right.
they don't even know where to go or where to begin.
It's just rails.
It's just rails. Rails are all untouchable now, which means you can't say anything almost, right? Except for maybe one kind of party line or something.
It's more like, it's actually a better analogy is like a minefield or one of those one of those lasers in a spy show, where
there's a game my kids play. There's a game my kids play, which is a perfect analogy, where in the living room they destroy our furniture by playing the game. The floor is lava. So you have to just jump on pieces of furniture, and
it's a terrible game.
It's a horrible game, but I think it's pretty much how I feel in society, where just everything is lava. And you just don't want to touch anything. You'll get burned, and it'll just be bad.
It's terrible. So we've talked before about my take on the allegory of the cave with respect to the issue of public discourse. I mean, privately we've talked about that. You may not remember my view on that, but I think that one of Plato's points there, right, is that coming up out of the cave and seeing things as they are, actually being able to see the truth as it really is, right, is one of the necessary conditions for participation in the polis. I think that's why the discussion is in the middle of the Republic, but I don't know what your opinion about that is, but it seems to me relevant to this discussion. If there's going to be a public discourse, there's got to be some preparation to engage in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's why, I don't know. I haven't come up with the proper archy to call it, or the proper political term, but basically Plato believes in the rule of the wise, right? I mean, that's what he advocates for in the Republic. Now, as it turns out, he thinks there's not very many people who are wise, and therefore the rulers will be few, or maybe even one. But yeah, no. I mean, I think the central idea is correct. Aristotle is going to, of course, expand on that and think that there's probably more people who have phronesis, right? A kind of, practical wisdom, maybe not, not a pure democracy in the way we think of it, of course, or maybe egalitarian democracy. But no, I think you're right. I mean, I think wisdom of some sort, to some degree, is requisite for participating in that conversation well. I also think, so why is that wisdom lacking, right? And here's the thing is I don't know that our leaders, read the Republic anymore, or think it's very relevant, right? So
or the Constitution.
Or the Constitution of the United States of America, right? So really, in some ways, you want to, I kind of, this maybe isn't shocking, but I would want to say I think the decline in public reason has something to do with the decline of higher education and models of education in general. I don't actually think, and it's going to sound a little elitist, but the truth is I think that, in most societies, there's a leading element, right? Whether that's formally codified by a legal system that reflects that, right, or not, right? There's always going to be, the kind of, you're never going to get rid of the elite, right? I mean, like in some sense,
there's a leadership class.
There's the leadership class, exactly, right. And you enact the revolution to overthrow all of authorities, and then the next day you start to build a new authority, right? Just reality of the matter, right? Because the leaders of the revolution are now sort of start telling you what to do, right? So I think there's going to be a leadership class, and so that's a political view of mine, or a political philosophy view of mine, right? And so why is it that the leadership class and the quality of of their education has declined, right? Because ostensibly many of them, not all of them, but many of them have the opportunity, right, to have a very high caliber education, right? And I think in part it's because the content of the education has changed, right? And the expectation of what it means to be a leading educated person, right, has changed a good bit, so I would trace, back to kind of a two things. One being the view that reason doesn't give you an ultimate unified approach to things, right? A coherent approach to things.
Mhm.
Alistair McIntyre writes about this in his book on God and the university, which is, the idea of the university is, of course, a profoundly Christian institution, developed in the medieval period. And, the ultimate unity of the institution is theology, and derived, from the unity of all things that are God. But once you get rid of God, then you can kind of replace God or displace God maybe with other ways of trying to create a telos for the university. But, kind of what we've devolved into is being sophist, right? We're going to, help you become wealthy and powerful. That's what the university is there to do. So I think that would be one side of it. And the other kind of version of that is the truncation of reason to science, which leaves us bereft of rationality in all other matters.
Yeah, right.
Do both those critiques make sense?
No, I agree. And so there, one of the other symptoms of it, right, is that the universe, there is no university actually, right? It's just silos of independent fields, right? That they're sort of loosely connected under some grand umbrella, but they don't really interact.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And then also that, when you reduce rationality to just science, right, then you end up saying, well, everything else is just merely subjective, right? It's just a matter of feeling, right? And that's where your emotivism becomes triumphant, right? So as soon as we start talking politics, culture, art, beauty, any of those sorts of things, right, friendship, then it's out the door. Like reason goes out the door, and it's about pleasure and pain become preeminent, right? So that
So the person who the person who's first to kind of lodge the complaint, right, is the person who sort of wins the argument, right?
That's right. Yeah, it was really interesting. I was at a conference some years ago at Villanova, and it was interesting. The main theme of the conference was on mysticism, which isn't particularly my area. I was presenting on something else, but the keynote lectures were all on mysticism in the medieval period. And one of the authors, one of the keynote speaker, right, the main one, she had an interesting criticism of contemporary fascination with mysticism, which I thought was kind of interesting. And she said that she was afraid that a good bit of it had to do with the cult of what she called suffering. In a kind of secularized form, right? That is that the only thing that is unquestionable, that cannot be critiqued, right, is your suffering, right? That we kind of put like human suffering up on sort of this pedestal, that wherever suffering is, that's the one thing we know that's bad, right? And so it kind of has this disproportionate role in our lives in terms of how we think about things, right? So it's enough to say like, well, what you're proposing is causing me discomfort or trauma or anxiety, to say that it's unethical, it's evil for you to propose what you're saying.
Yeah, right. And the major, of course, obviously the logical weakness to that position, aside from the fact that it's not a logical position at all,
That's right. It's mere sentimentality, right?
Yeah. But if you want to sort of like, throw the critique into it, you would note that sometimes, if I try to assuage your suffering, that'll cause me suffering, right? So one of us is going to suffer in this relationship. How do we determine who it's going to be? That's the thing. I don't think there's any resolution to that from the purely subjectivist perspective.
That's right. Yeah, I think you'd have to bring in sort of a broader critique, a broader theory about the dialectic of oppression at that point, right? And say, well, really, Rich, your feelings of suffering don't count because you're part of the oppressor class, right? And so, yeah, you're suffering. That's just because you're evil. Yeah. So your suffering in this case
and a priori
is irrelevant.
We've already determined a priori that we know which is the oppressor and which is the oppressed in that.
Sure. Yeah.
In that.
And you can't even question.
Yeah.
So again, that undermines, right, public reason, right?
Right.
If half of the side of the conversation can't even, get a seat at the table, then
yeah, that's what Cardinal Newman, right? He described as poisoning the well of discourse, and it's always been regarded as a logical fallacy.
That's right. Absolutely, yeah. And the worst thing about it, if you care about the truth at all, and we'll just say ostensibly some people do, maybe, it deprives you of the opportunity to see if what you think is actually really true.
Yeah, right.
Right. Like in the sort of the dialectical push, the debate, right? It's, a Socratic debate that's supposed to be a test, right? Where we can actually see, whether or not what we think is true, right? I know one of my, I think I've told you all this before, but one of my experiences now, having studied philosophy for a long time, is, having to, sort of revise some of my views and attitudes. And one of those, is I have this old ancient copy of the collected, or I don't know, it's not all the works, but like say an anthology of the works of John Stuart Mill that I have for my freshman year, first semester, right? And it's marked up, and I mean, there's some foul language in there. And I'm just like, I can't stand the guy, right? So like, I'm writing all these like super negative things about John Stuart Mill, like his both his essay on liberty, as well as his essay on utilitarianism, but especially the one on liberty. Well, that's when I was like 18 or 19, right? Several decades later, I kind of started to think, well, I still think John Stuart Mill is fundamentally wrong, but like I find myself more, sympathetic, right, to a lot of his concerns, than I did, those years ago. So, that's one of the things he brings up, right, is that, he of course he likes to use people like inquisitors or whatever, but anyways, he's a 19th century English guy, so that's what it is. So, but like, he wants to say, like, if you're going to be a guardian of the truth, right, such that you preclude debate over the truth, then the first, one of the first victims of that is the truth, right? Because you might just be holding to something that,
isn't true,
right? And if you don't let anybody ever debate it, and this, saying this kind of, hearing myself speak this way reminds me of the left, kind of center left professors that I was taught by, right? Like I was taught mostly by, I wouldn't call them radically left, but center left professors. My grandparents are probably that way. They were that way. They believed in free debate and all this good academic freedom.
That was a thing once.
That was a thing. That's right.
Yeah.
It's no longer a thing. Yeah.
So what I find interesting about the problem that you're naming here, right, is the kind of dogmatism of it, is that we've shifted from a sort of like faith-centered view of knowledge, right, to the post-Enlightenment reason-centered view of knowledge, I'm not drawing the false dichotomy, right? I'm saying natural reason, right? Natural reason centered.
Yeah.
And the problem is, right, if I'm making the argument from faith, I'm making the argument from revelation. Now, you either grant revelation or you don't, right? I can't really demonstrate that by natural reason. But if you grant revelation, then you have a basis for making the claim that there's a dogma that can't be questioned, right? You have a basis for saying it's beyond human reason to begin with. You're not going to reason yourself to it in the first place. And maybe you just don't understand it because it comes from God. But trust me, we have to say this, right? There's a basis for that position. There's no basis for that position if our starting point is natural reason alone.
Sure.
And what I find bizarre is that we actually have become increasingly dogmatic about certain things that we're claiming, right? Not the product of divine revelation, but are the product of natural reason.
Yeah. I mean, there's an epistemological weakness there, right? And I think they just, again, we don't study epistemology, or I mean, our leadership class doesn't really care about that, right? It's not trained in that way. They're not nurtured to have a kind of character that's oriented towards thinking about epistemology and certainty and reason and truth and that kind of thing, right? I was listening to a lecture on the founding fathers of the United States of America and their view of education, right? And the role of education, especially for those who are going to be leaders in the burgeoning republic, right? Mm-hmm. And they said it had to do with having that the outcome needed to be something like this: a person who was wary, right, of his own certitude and wary of his own possibilities for vice, but was inspired nevertheless to lead by high ideals, right, and inspired not to be a tyrant, right? Mm-hmm. Right, that was the main, like that you have the sense of public service, right, as a high calling, not ambition, right?
Right.
Now ambition's a good word.
Yeah,
which is interesting. I mean, like in the days of the founders, it wasn't.
It was actually for a long time considered a vice, I think, pretty universally.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So I think that's I think all of that's a big part of why we're in such a bad situation. You talk about the lack of trust in the institutions. I think we don't trust them, right? Yeah. Because
they're not trustworthy.
they seem to not be too trustworthy, right? Or if we're going to be really radical about our this kind of like reduction of reason to mere sentiment, right? Then, it's just their sentiment against mine, or their feelings against my feelings, right? And, then all of a sudden you want to jump in and go, no, but I've got expertise here, right? Well, okay, that's fine. But then, where is that? What's that expertise grounded in? Right. Mm-hmm. And the problem, with all of that is we just don't have enough shared ethos, right, to back up claims of expertise, right? We listen to doctors to some degree, right? We listen to scientists to some degree. But in this sort of kind of overall situation in which we find ourselves, that you described as a motivist, I think it's a good description. It doesn't have a lot of purchase,
Yeah, I think go on.
I was going to say, with this, I like the way you described it, Dr. Bulzacchelli, with this new kind of dogmatism. But it also, when you use that word, it also makes me think of then, by what authority, so
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
In this new, in this new post-Christian world where, Christianity is becoming even more, there's public disdain for it even more, who is the, with the Catholic Church, I can say the magisterium. There is the authority, right? Sacred scripture. There is the authority. With this new kind of dogmatism, where do I look in the world and say there's the authority? How does somebody identify the authority from where these new dogmas are coming from?
So here's a stab at it, or a way it at least works out, right?
Yeah.
Which is that. So I've been using this phrase, public reason, right? So I kind of like the idea that there is such a thing as public reason, but then, Kant, he talks about public reason in one place, if I remember correctly, in his wonderful little text, religion within the bounds of reason alone, right? So
could you get a hold of mine? Yeah.
So, in which he says wonderful things like, Jesus is a great example of Christianity, but strictly speaking, he's not necessary. Anyways, Kant says, me, right? Like people like Kant, they're the ones, right? They're kind of, he even says, I think, as a report that public intellectuals are to replace the priest, right? Because they have, and it is interesting, this goes along with this kind of general kind of movement among Germans. It was very especially appealing to younger Germans, younger than Kant, but Kant was kind of became sort of like a little bit of their like go-to guy on this, especially with his emphasis on autonomy. But there was a kind of, it melded with the German Romantic movement, where there was this idea of like, well, if I'm cultivated in a certain way, right? I read just the right books and I'm cultivated in the right way, and I learn and I throw off tradition, and I think for myself, and I go to the right salons and have the right conversations. I know salon is French, but it's parallel in German. And then I will become enlightened, right? Or there'll be a group of people who are enlightened. And they're really the people that we should listen to.
Yeah. I think
today they're journalists.
Right.
Journalists and scientists.
Right. Yeah. I think that's about right. But again, I think that's breaking down. And what will replace it? So going back to my original statement about where I think the crises lie, and the general collapse of trust in institutions. I think that at the same time as there's a collapse in trust in institutions, there's also a tendency on the part of those in the institutions to hold on as tightly as they possibly can to their claims. Right. So this leads to, I think, an increasing hostility between the institutions and those over whom the institutions tend to rule in one way or another. And again, in all areas of society.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that. And it, from a historical and political philosophical perspective, reminds one a great deal of, the optimes against the populi in ancient Rome, right? That's, we get the word populist from, for the people. And interestingly, of course, in Rome, the senators and the senator class and the equestrian class tended to be conservative, right? And the populi tended to not be so much, right? It's sort of changed, post-Enlightenment. It kind of makes sense, right? Because our new senator class is made up of the enlightened.
It is interesting, though. It is interesting that you could imagine, if you sort of imagine, sort of a law of entropy, right?
Okay.
And the mass of the population would, not united. This is the false premise, I think, not united by any common body of knowledge or something, right? That they would all tend to go their own way. And so they would tend to be innovators, right? They would tend to want to change things all the time according to their whims. And therefore the governing class, right, would tend to be conservative. But what's really strange in our current arrangement, now, first of all, I reject that first premise, because I do think that the common people actually have a common body of, they do have common traditions that unite them, right? But the strange thing is now we've got we've got the ruling class not being conservative.
Mhm.
This is the part that's a little harder to understand, I think. I mean, you said it's because of from the Enlightenment model. It's not entirely clear. It's not intuitively obvious, I guess, that this would suddenly switch the tables on the whole thing. Explain how that works.
Yeah, well, I think two things. One, you certainly wouldn't be sudden, right? But I do think, once you've sort of gotten the, kind of moved in Kantian directions, right? And then later in sort of Hegelian directions, right? Well, the natural law sort of falls away, right?
Yeah.
Tradition or custom as a guidance falls away. Revelation as a form of guidance falls away. Again, gradually in bits and pieces, that kind of thing, but still sort of like in a trajectory. And so, if to be enlightened is to think for yourself, right? I mean, you just look at the way the shape of rhetoric before, like in the ancient medieval world, is innovator is like a curse word.
Yeah, right.
Now we think of innovator as, the best. Right?
Yeah.
Thinking for yourself is, kind of suspect, right? To an ancient Roman or a Greek or something like that. Not thinking for yourself, right? Supposedly, right? At least for the enlightened is what's degraded. So I think that you sort of see the trajectory in that direction, right? The more you're thinking for yourself, the more you're sort of a self-determining, sort of thing.
At least that's the ideal.
Right. Yes. So, that's the claim, because you could always criticize whether they really are.
Yeah.
Right?
Whether that's even what they really want you to do.
Not you. Yeah. But them. I think.
Yeah. Right.
Them being.
But I defy you to pick up any issue of, say, Smithsonian Magazine or some similar thing and read through an issue without finding several times a phrase similar to or identical with X person gleefully upends some, sort of idea or tradition or something like that, right? Reimagining, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
That's the kind of, you see that all the time in the highbrow literature.
Sure.
And that is the aspiration, right? To overturn everything.
That's right. Yep. Jason,
not to go off on a big Marxist rant there when you're talking about revolution and overthrowing everything, but like, what do you think the role of atheism has in all this? And not just like, overt atheism, but what Benedict XVI called practical atheism. So even people that claim to believe in God, but essentially acted and lived their entire life as if there's no God as well. So do you think that underlies a lot of this, or?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think
I
think one of the things that's great about I'm going to sound kind of biased here, but whatever. I think I can defend it. I think
podcast.
I think the Enlightenment, historians of the Enlightenment have consistently, not universally, but consistently distinguished between what they call the moderate Enlightenment and the radical Enlightenment. And usually the moderate Enlightenment is the Anglo-American tradition, right? In which there is still a robust idea that God has to be part of it, in which you have figures of the Whig Party, which is the liberal party in England, who is Edmund Burke, who's like the founder of modern conservatism, right? In its modern idiom, right? And you find trenchant statements among the American founders about the necessity of religion for a republic, right? You don't find anything like that in Rousseau. You don't find anything like that in Diderot. You don't find anything like that in Kant, right? Like, I mean, it really is a different trajectory, I think. Whereas I think in the sort of Anglo-American Enlightenment, certainly there is a changing of the guard, right? And certainly there is, the kings are the days of the kings are passing, right? But again, it's interesting that They didn't get rid of it in England, right? I mean, they could have put the king in a guillotine, right? Mm-hmm. They had the opportunity. Thankfully, James II just escaped and went into exile, right? And after that, it was the Glorious Revolution and the monarch and the Prince of Orange, right? William accepted basically a kind of titular monarchy, right? Which shows you the conservatism of that kind of Enlightenment, right? If that makes sense. So I think, but that's just specifically on the issue of religion, though, and God, right? Atheism is not an English or American thing in the Enlightenment. There's deism, right, among the kind of most edgy of the ones, but again, the American founders don't act like that. They don't talk like that, right? I mean, you look at the petitions that would go from the Continental Congress to all the churches, right, to pray for the Continental Army. George Washington's prayers. He wasn't no deist, right? So in any event, there may have been some deism around there. Maybe Ben Franklin was, but he's kind of an outlier, I think, among the founding fathers in that.
But even the deists, though, right? Even the deists, they still believed that there was a God who designed the universe.
That's right. There's a design. Mm-hmm.
That the universe operated according to certain laws, including in the moral arena.
Mm-hmm. In a moral arena,
right? So it was not any kind of free for all. It may not be what I would consider ultimately a satisfactory theological account, but it's not a complete free for all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think theism plays a huge role. Theism versus atheism, right? A huge role in it, because with the demise of theism or religion in general, right, you get rid of one of the bedrock unifying elements of society, right? Mm-hmm. In addition to that, you get rid of an authority over the state, right? Which is, I think, enormously important, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's huge.
Yep. And so once that's gone, I think you're in a very vulnerable position, to the point at which Hegel sort of capitalizes on all this, in a sort of twisting together a lot of different elements. I mean, he ultimately thinks that the German state under Bismarck was the end of history, right? Like it was rationality fully realized, right?
Yeah.
In the Bismarck, in Bismarck's government, and in fact, the writing of the Phenomenology of Spirit was like the culminating announcement, right, of the end of history.
So what's really interesting is
it's pretty cool.
We have this the phrase we use today, culture war, right, actually comes from that period. The Kulturkampf, right? Mm-hmm. He was waging a culture war, and of course the Catholic Church was at the center of it.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a big part. So I don't know, is that kind of what you were thinking, Jason, as far as atheism and theism, or well, do you have something else in mind?
Yeah, no, definitely, and just how seeing how it plays a. I mean, if you're a country that's founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and yet you've become a society that is at least practical atheist, something philosophically has got to change. But the one that I think that probably has suffered a lot from kind of just practical atheism as well is just our view of the human person, right? So like you said, at least the founding fathers, they saw a design of the universe. Like we wouldn't be, and the human person being part of that universe as well. Like the founding fathers would not be sitting here debating about gender theory or how many genders were there and things like that. No, it was something that was simply recognized in nature. But I think over the course of time, if you live your it seems that a natural effect of atheism then is you stop seeing the person as the imago Dei. You stop seeing the person as having a design that is anything but self-created.
Yeah, sure. And I think you also have to kind of come up with a way of describing natural rights or rights, right? At least in the American setup, right? That doesn't require an endowment by the creator,
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas that's very front and center, right, in the American form of kind of classical liberalism or moderate Enlightenment. It comes into there's this new sort of basis, right, which seemed to be something like autonomy, right, or something similar to that, right, or some sort of radical egalitarianism.
Right, but even then, like the thing that just, again, this kind of goes back to what we were saying in the beginning, is that we don't have the ability to think rationally. Is well, if everything about you as a human person is totally unique, and we share nothing, because everything I am is self-determined, and everything you are is self-determined, then why? How can there be any sort of equality between us?
Well, I guess
well, do we want to go in the Nietzsche direction on this?
Well, I think you'd say something like, well, we're alike only in this, that we are all self-determining.
Yeah, good luck working things out that way, though. I mean, right? This is where Nietzsche's will to power comes in, right?
Sure.
It seems to me somebody just wins. I assert my interests over yours.
Yeah, there's no logical argument against that. Right. Against what you're saying. I mean, you're right, Rich. That critique is correct. Right. There's no, one side to say, hey, you know what? I'm actually an Ubermensch. And my self-determination includes determining stuff about you. Right. Yeah. Well, no, we're all the same. So what? We're also.
I am the science.
Right. We're all self-determining. We should, and since we're all this, here's the thing: is there's this last vestige, right, of an implicit appeal to, you should treat like things as like and unlike things as unalike, right?
Yeah.
Which is, since we're all self-determining, we should all treat each other equally and like as self-determining things, right?
Yeah.
But that last little principle there is not something you've determined. Right. It's something it's a hidden premise underneath there.
Right.
We don't want to bring it to the fore, because that brings metaphysics back into view and more austere accounts of justice. But, since I'm self-determining and you're self-determining, we should both just allow each other to proceed with our self-determiningness character, whatever you call it. Yeah.
Right. Interesting derivation of an odd statement from an is, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's ultimately then you're kind of appealing to a scrap, right, of the natural law. Which there's a book I've been interested in reading. It's a Protestant guy. He's an apologist, but it's really an apologetics vis-a-vis secularism and atheism. But the title of it, and I've heard him talk about it, is "Stealing from God," and which is a very clever title, right? His basic thesis is that secular folks and atheists are all the time really just stealing part of the theistic or Christian worldview in order to kind of prop up the kind of the loose ends, right, of their worldview that doesn't actually all hang together, right? So that was interesting.
Like rationality.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
All right. Any final thoughts? Maybe some final few minutes on, give us some hope. You've given us some good, I think a good prognosis or a good diagnosis. Maybe point us where to go from here. What do you think? How can we? How do we survive in this arid landscape of today?
Well, I want to jump in there with two things. I'll let you finish, Rich. One is, despite all of this, I tend to have some optimism about the reaction, right? There has been a strong reaction to institutional corruption, to the decline of public reason, The problem with being scientistic is that scientism doesn't give you enough to live a life, right? It just, you're asking science
too much of your life.
Yeah, you're asking science to do things it can't, and that's why I like all these debates about vaccines and everything. Leaving aside whether you should get vaccinated or not, you just can't decide the argument just on the basis of science, right? Like there are other issues that have to be considered, like your philosophy of the human person, like your views on ethics, right? All those sorts of things, right? So there's an enormous pushback, I think, on a lot of this, on political correctness, on the more kind of hard edge sides of the kind of, neo-Marxism. So I'm encouraged to see all of those things, right? It doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to have a lot of impact at the institutional level, but an encouraging thing is that I think people don't feel as beholden to the institutional level of society anymore, right? And so, not to be a rabble rouser, but I do kind of think like, it's just like, this is in some ways an unfortunate shakeup. You can't really have an effective society in which there's a profound skepticism in the institutions of it, right? That just doesn't work well. At the same time, maybe this is one of those strange little periods where this is kind of what has to be the case until, society kind of figures out some way forward, right? My other positive response is more practical, which is that, the way to respond to this is to do what's under your control, right? Focus on that, right? Educate yourself as much as you possibly can, expose yourself to good sources, interact with people who are logical. Our Lord says not to throw your pearls before swine. Don't spend all your time arguing with people on Facebook. There's no point, right? Take care of educating your kids. Those sorts of practical things, I think, are going to equip you to do well. Also will help preserve your sanity, and, give you the opportunity to collaborate in creative and constructive ways with other people who are not going down this trail. So that's what I would say, sort of from a practical point. Do the thing that you can. It's almost sound kind of like a hippie here, think globally but act locally, right? I actually think that's not a bad tactic, right? For responding to this.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree, and I would say actually this tendency toward living your life at a more local and interpersonal level, right, is actually how the solution will be found, I think, right? Because I think that's where that alternative to the current structures will develop. Now, that being said, I think that, if we could characterize the nature of the struggle and maybe give some perspective on how we can view it as a hopeful thing, right? Is maybe to cast it like this, right? Let's say that it's sort of like a parent whose child has reached adulthood, and the parent won't accept that fact and struggles to keep the child sort of under his control, and he can't hold on to that situation, right? It's untenable, right? And sooner or later, when the when you get to that point where the authority simply goes unaccepted, then the power is completely lost, right, and a new state of affairs ensues. That, I think, is kind of the trajectory that we're on a grand sort of global sociological level. That's the impression I get.
No, that's fair.
And I think the way to realizing that is that living life on a more, instead of sort of turning toward, taking too much of a global perspective, you're ceding everything to the authorities, right? You're ceding everything to the established institutions, the very thing that you're having such a huge problem with at the moment.
Right.
And so that withdrawal, right? That withdrawal is itself going to facilitate the change that's required.
Yep, that sounds great. Yeah, just a last little note here, following up this. Obviously, Rod Dreher has talked about this in his Benedict option, which is a cause of much debate and fun. but I think it's interesting. Like regardless of how much you agree or disagree with him, I think the topic he raised is really helpful. And then even before him, at the end of After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre, right? And this is right before Alistair McIntyre came back to being a Catholic. He wrote about the idea that because of the problems with emotivism and also something else he calls incommensurability, that at the end he's saying, look, we're basically in a situation where we're kind of in a I think you used the term entropy before, right? Mm-hmm. We're in cultural entropy, right? Is what we're experiencing, and that we'll begin to pick up when we find. I think he says another, but probably a very different Saint Benedict, right? Which I think is interesting. That's where Roger kind of picks that up from, right? Is McIntyre saying, and kind of going what you're saying is building new institutions, laying the groundwork, right, for building new institutions.
All right, very good. The quote that came to mind just now when you were talking about that is one that's in St. Louis de Montfort's True Devotion to Mary. He's got this beautiful section. I forget exactly what he's talking about, but he has this wonderful quote about kind of your disposition to life in kind of some crazy times. And he says, fight with one hand and build with another one, with the other one, and I think that's I think that's a good, maybe a good little metaphor of don't just think that you have to sit here and, fight on Facebook or fight on Twitter as if that actually does anything. But, work at creating something, work at building something up, and, begins in the home, and it begins, within your own interior life,
Sure.
So excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bulzacchelli, Dr. Smith, for coming on, giving us some guidance, pointing us to some good directions, and hopefully offering our listeners some wisdom to calmly get us through whatever hard times we're going through, whatever hard times may come. And to give us the perseverance of the cross. So until next time, we'll see everybody. Thank you for listening. God bless.